Today is Monday, February 9th, 2026, and if you're watching this broadcast, you're witnessing one of the most consequential moments in American political history unfold in real time. What we're about to discuss isn't speculation, isn't hyperbole, and isn't partisan rhetoric. It's a documented series of events that occurred over this past weekend and the days leading up to it. Events that have fundamentally altered the relationship between the federal government and American citizens, between constitutional authority and executive power, and between the America we thought we knew and the America we're becoming. On Saturday, February 8th, just yesterday morning, during MSNBC's Morning Joe program, the Senate Minority Leader of the United States stood before cameras and detailed what he characterized as the deployment of secret police on American streets, federal interference in state election systems, and the systematic violation of constitutional rights that every American, regardless of political affiliation, once considered sacred and inviolable. If you think this sounds like something that happens in other countries, in places we watch on the news and thank goodness we don't live there, I need you to understand something crucial. This is happening here, this is happening now, and by the time you finish watching this broadcast, you'll understand why millions of Americans are asking themselves a question they never imagined they'd have to ask. Is American democracy in genuine danger? The extraordinary developments we're examining today began crystallizing over the past 72 hours. But their roots extend back through weeks and months of escalating tensions between federal enforcement agencies and state governments, between the executive branch and Congress, and between competing visions of what constitutional governance means in practice. What makes this moment particularly alarming isn't any single action in isolation. It's the pattern, the accumulation, the systematic nature of what's occurring across multiple states simultaneously. From Minnesota to Georgia, from New York to Arizona, we're witnessing a coordinated effort that raises profound questions about the limits of federal power and the resilience of the democratic institutions that have defined American government for nearly 2.5 centuries. Just this past Saturday morning, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer of New York appeared on national television to lay out what he called simple, common-sense proposals that read like something from a different era. Proposals that in any other time in American history would be considered obvious and uncontroversial. He spoke about requiring federal agents to identify themselves. He spoke about prohibiting warrantless arrests of American citizens. He spoke about banning masked enforcement personnel from operating on American streets. And the fact that these proposals are now considered controversial, that they require legislation and political battles to implement, tells you everything you need to know about how far we've traveled from constitutional norms. The images that have dominated news coverage over the past 2 weeks have shocked the conscience of Americans across the political spectrum. A 5-year-old child, an American citizen, held in federal custody for more than 2 weeks before a judge ordered the child's release. 2 37-year-old Americans shot and killed during immigration enforcement operations in Minnesota. 1 woman shot in the face, 1 man shot in the back. Federal agents wearing masks conducting what Schumer called roving patrols, detaining individuals without warrants, busting down doors without judicial authorization, operating with an apparent immunity from accountability that makes a mockery of constitutional protections Americans have taken for granted for generations. But the crisis extends far beyond enforcement tactics. This weekend brought new revelations about federal interference in state election systems that should alarm every American who believes in free and fair elections, regardless of their political affiliation. In Fulton County, Georgia, the FBI seized 700 boxes of election materials from 2020, without clear legal justification. In Minnesota, the Justice Department allegedly offered to scale back ICE operations in exchange for voter registration rolls, a quid pro quo that represents exactly the kind of pressure that undermines democratic governance. And most disturbing of all, Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, whose job is to gather intelligence about foreign threats, has been deployed to Georgia to examine state election systems, an unprecedented use of intelligence resources for domestic political purposes. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, conducted emergency oversight hearings over the weekend questioning what he called a fundamental misuse of intelligence authority. The Director of National Intelligence was created after September 11th to coordinate intelligence about international terrorism and hostile foreign governments. The position was never intended to have any role in domestic election administration, which is constitutionally reserved to the states. Yet here we are, watching the nation's top intelligence official appear at election offices in swing states demanding access to voting materials, creating what election officials describe as an atmosphere of intimidation. Meanwhile, the economic narrative being promoted by the administration has diverged sharply from reality. President Trump continues to claim he inherited the highest inflation in 48 years, a statement that economic data definitively disproves. During last week's cabinet meeting, Trump stated that his administration inherited very high prices and historic inflation. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent echoed these claims during congressional testimony. But Steve Rattner, appearing on Morning Joe with comprehensive data analysis, systematically dismantled these assertions with facts that are readily verifiable. The data shows unambiguously that Trump inherited an inflation rate of approximately 3%, down from pandemic highs of 9%, a rate that represents success in bringing inflation under control, not a crisis requiring emergency action. Since taking office, inflation has declined marginally to 2.7%. This is not economic rescue. This is continuation of an existing trend. More concerning, Rattner's analysis of tariff impacts reveals that consumer prices, which had been declining from October 2024 through January 2025, reversed sharply after the administration's Liberation Day tariffs took effect. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell testified just days ago that tariffs have contributed 1 to 2 percentage points to inflation, directly contradicting administration claims that tariffs have no inflationary impact. On manufacturing, another administration talking point, the data again tells a different story. Trump claims factories are returning to America and manufacturing jobs are booming. The reality is that manufacturing construction spending, which surged during 2023 and 2024 under Biden administration policies, including the CHIPS and Science Act, has been declining steadily since Trump took office. Manufacturing employment is falling, not rising. Automobile manufacturing jobs are declining as companies scale back electric vehicle investments in response to the administration's policy hostility toward that sector. In New York, Governor Kathy Hochul has positioned her state as a bulwark against what she characterizes as federal overreach. On Friday, she announced the Local Cops, Local Crimes Act, legislation that would ban agreements allowing local police to be deputized as immigration enforcement agents. Speaking emotionally during her Morning Joe appearance, Hochul described federal agents as bumbling idiots carrying loaded weapons, noting that professional police departments would have de-escalated the situations that resulted in 2 deaths in Minnesota within seconds using proper training and tactics. She warned that New York is preparing for a potential surge in ICE operations, and the state will use every regulatory tool available to impede federal actions that violate constitutional principles. The governor noted that intelligence suggests federal authorities are planning to construct a large detention center 45 miles outside New York City. She stated bluntly that state agencies will scrutinize every aspect of that proposal, examining wetlands regulations, zoning compliance, and environmental impacts. The message was clear. New York will not cooperate with what it views as an unconstitutional federal campaign. Perhaps most alarmingly, these developments are occurring against the backdrop of what New York Times columnist David French calls a failure to recognize the threat level. In a column entitled "This is Not a Drill," French argued that millions of Americans remain too complacent, unaware of the genuine peril facing democratic institutions. He described his column as a fire alarm, one of thousands that should be ringing across the country, warning that acts of aggression are already intimidating and another kind of theft may already be underway. The Morning Joe host referenced the period before January 6, 2021, when even Trump critics largely failed to imagine he would actually incite a violent assault on the Capitol. Opinion writers predicted there would be no Trump coup. Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney stated publicly that Trump would concede gracefully if he lost. These predictions proved catastrophically wrong. The hosts argued that the phrase "Trump being Trump" once meant mostly bluster with little action. After January 6, that phrase must be understood differently. Trump being Trump now means he will attempt to do exactly what he says, including efforts to manipulate elections. His intentions are not hidden. He states them openly and directly. Senate Minority Leader Schumer's Saturday appearance outlined a unified Democratic response spanning both chambers of Congress. The proposal has three main components: ending warrantless detention and roving patrols, implementing accountability measures, including use of force codes and mandatory training, and banning secret police by requiring identification, body cameras, and standard uniforms. These restrictions would apply not only to new funding, but to all existing appropriations, meaning ICE operations would need to comply regardless of budget maneuvers. Schumer stated the Democrats are united from one end of the party to the other, from progressives to moderates. He emphasized that these are not radical proposals, but common sense measures used by police forces and sheriffs everywhere. The question being asked across America is why House Speaker Mike Johnson and congressional Republicans oppose these basic accountability standards. Why do they support allowing federal agents to wear masks when police in their own districts are required to display names and badge numbers? Why do they defend warrantless arrests when the Constitution explicitly prohibits them? The answer, many analysts suggest, relates to the broader pattern of authoritarian drift that has characterized this administration. The deployment of masked agents, the seizure of election materials, the use of intelligence agencies for domestic political purposes, the false economic narratives. These are not isolated incidents. They represent a coordinated effort to consolidate power, suppress dissent, and manipulate democratic processes. As we stand here on Monday evening, February 9th, 2026, the situation remains fluid and increasingly dangerous. A Department of Homeland Security shutdown looms within days if Congress cannot reach agreement. Democrats have pledged they will not fund ICE operations without accountability measures. Republicans appear determined to allow continued operations without restrictions. The impasse threatens not just a funding crisis, but a constitutional confrontation over the fundamental nature of American governance. What happens next will define whether American democratic institutions can withstand unprecedented pressure, whether constitutional protections retain meaning when politically inconvenient, and whether citizens across the political spectrum will demand their government operate within the boundaries that have defined this republic for nearly 2.5 centuries. The alarm bells are ringing. The question is whether Americans are listening and whether they will act before it's too late.